conversation. I'm pleased to say joining me now is Congressman Brad Sherman, the Democrat from California, who also sits on the Financial Services Committee. So, Congressman, that makes your perspective valuable here. If you were to just look at the data today, it would suggest that perhaps Bidenomics is working, yet it isn't resonating with voters. So, if that's the case, does it really matter at all?
Well, certainly it matters for the economy. Winning elections is nice, but the country doing well is the reason we try to win elections. I think this will resonate. There's now in the polling a disconnect with how people feel they're doing economically personally and how they feel the country is doing. And I think that discordance will narrow as we get to the election, and people will say, "Hey, I'm doing all right. My cousin's got a job, and maybe the entire economy is doing well." Certainly, results like this with negative inflation, albeit a little bit, and only on the top line, but to see this downward pressure on prices is very good.
Well, and this downward pressure on prices have led many in financial markets and others to say, hey, the Fed is probably going to turn around and start cutting rates pretty soon. I know that often there is a dislike of weighing in on Fed policy among elected representatives, but do you think that that would be a fair assumption, that the Fed is going to be in a position to cut rates in the not so distant future?
I think the market thinks that. I'm not reluctant to chime in on this, but the effect of this blockade by the Houthi of the Red Sea, let's see what that does, not only to the goods that typically go through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, but also the price of shipping. Because if you're going to need hundreds and hundreds of ships going around the Cape of Good Hope, that's just ships that aren't available, and shipping is a supply and demand. So we've got to look at the geopolitical, both the Middle East and Ukraine. But I'm hoping very much that we see a rate cut in March or April.
So you raised some of these geopolitical concerns, like what we're seeing in the Red Sea, that potentially is a risk, not just in terms of energy flow and energy prices, but also supply chains. We all remember what happened during the pandemic, how those supply chains got snarled, and that's really a large part of what got us into this inflationary mess in the first place. What is your degree of concern at this point that we could find ourselves in, if not as dramatic, at least a similar position again?
Oh, I don't think it'll be as dramatic as we saw 2 or 3 years ago, but you've got a lot of ships that are now going around the Cape of Good Hope, and so their journeys will take almost twice as long, and that means those ships aren't available to bid on the next bit of cargo, whether that cargo is going across the Pacific or whatever route it might take. So I do think shipping costs will go up. The hope is that this is just a blip, and hopefully we can push the Iranians and their subsidiary, the Houthis, out of this process of blockading the Red Sea.
Well, Congressman, how exactly in your mind should that pushing happen? Because we have seen the U.S. assembling a task force, which the Pentagon says now includes 20 nations trying to deter and defend essentially merchant vessels in the Red Sea. That, though, is not an offensive move. Would you be encouraging the U.S. to directly strike the Houthis at this point?
We hope that we can deal with this just by playing defense, just by shooting down the drones and showing commercial shippers and insurers that this is safe. If that doesn't happen, we can either take violent action against the Houthis, or we can expose the Iranians to what they're exposing the world to. We can interrupt their shipping in any ocean of the world. So whether it is a threat and detention of this or that ship bound for Iran, or whether it is kinetic action against the Houthi, if that's necessary, I think we do it. As of now, we may be able to create safety just by shooting down drones and missiles that the Houthi launch.
Well, and of course, the consideration for the U.S. here is the idea that they don't want to escalate this conflict any further, right? They don't want this to turn into a broader regional conflict beyond what is already happening between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And that's where I'd like to go with you next, Congressman, if we could. The UN Security Council just passed a resolution today, the U.S. abstaining from this vote, that calls for the continued flow of aid and increased flow of aid into the Gaza Strip. It stopped short of demanding a ceasefire. And part of that was because of the U.S.'s concerns about that language, because that is not something the administration is pushing at this point. But there are growing calls for that, sir, as we see the death toll in Gaza rising substantially. Knowing especially that you are the co-chair of the Israel Allies Conference or Caucus in the House, what do you say for calls for Israel to stop the bombing?
The scenes we see in Gaza are horrendous. We want the killing to end. Israel has offered a week-long ceasefire if the terrorists will release 40 hostages. That has been rejected by Hamas. We could have a permanent ceasefire if Hamas were to release all the hostages and either disarm themselves and turn themselves in, or I think we could arrange a departure for the Hamas fighters, or at least their top leadership, to Iran or a similar country. But as long as Hamas insists upon a bargaining for a ceasefire that is simply a chance for them to regroup and repeat their rampages of October 7th, obviously no sane person is going to accept that. But we could have a week-long ceasefire. Israel has offered that, not for even all the hostages, but just for 40. Hamas knows that as long as the people of Gaza die, Hamas becomes more popular in the world, and they keep doing it.
Well, to these ideas of negotiations around another potential agreement to release the hostages, obviously there was a temporary ceasefire earlier in the conflict. It ended several weeks ago. There was a lot of conversation at that time for when that stopped, this idea that it would be much harder to reach a deal the second time around. How confident are you that another deal can be reached between Hamas and Israel and those parties that are helping negotiate this?
Hamas realized that they had a public relations problem if they held children, women, and foreigners, chiefly agricultural workers from the Philippines and Thailand. And they have released those in return for many concessions. Obviously, the idea of kidnapping hostages and getting concessions shouldn't please anybody, but they got the concessions and they released. When it comes to male hostages, even the elderly, you just saw they recently released a video of 3 men over the age of 70. They are trying to extract enormous prices for those hostages, and I don't think they'll be successful. But we can have a week-long ceasefire, which is a giant resupply opportunity to the people of Gaza. If only release 40 hostages, presumably they would be releasing elderly men.
Well, Congressman, of course, when you return to Washington after this holiday break, the issue of funding for Israel, as well as funding for Ukraine and border security, is one that is probably going to be front and center, in addition to trying to fund the government and avoid a partial shutdown on January 19th. When it comes to that supplemental funding package, what border measures do you, as a Democrat in the House of Representatives, think are appropriate for the White House to compromise on here?
Well, I'm not going to negotiate on radio. I think the Biden opening position of having an orderly border with our border control properly funded, that's our position now. If we're going to actually change any of our policies, that needs to be negotiated behind closed doors. But the idea that Republicans would fail to fund aid for Israel and aid to Ukraine in order to extract a concession of what is pretty much a domestic issue, that's not the Republican Party I saw 20 years ago.
Okay, so how does all of this come together then? What is your degree of confidence that a supplemental is going to be able to be passed at all when even there's questions around the must pass must pass appropriation bills.
I have 50-50 confidence in our ability to fund Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and border. One could imagine that if that was stymied, that Israel would move forward separately. Don't know, and that certainly isn't the administration's position. Then we face possible shutdown of the U.S. government, some of it on the 19th of January, some on February 2nd. And the Republican bargaining position hasn't even been articulated, let alone, their reluctance to have another CR or continuing resolution means we could very well face shutdowns of the U.S. government at the beginning of the next year. This is the Republicans are so unreasonable they won't even articulate openly what their position is.
Well, 2024, Congressman, is going to be a doozy for a multitude of reasons. But on the subject of 2024, of course, a lot of news was made this week when the Colorado State Supreme Court ruled that former President Trump should be off the ballot in that state, that he is ineligible to be president on the grounds of the 14th Amendment. And I actually spoke with your colleague, a Democrat from California, just like you, John Garamendi, about this earlier. And his take was interesting. I'd like to get your response to it. This is what he had to say.
I believe that Trump should be given the chance to be on the ballot, and I suspect the Supreme Court will so rule. Were that not to happen, I believe we'd have a very serious, very, very serious political crisis in the United States if, in fact, Trump were not allowed to be on the presidential, on the ballots in November.
Congressman Sherman, do you agree with that view?
I think we'd face major difficulty if he wasn't allowed to be on the ballot, although many of my Republican friends would hope that the Republicans would nominate a different candidate, Nikki Haley or whomever. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is a inadequately defined and highly dangerous provision. It not only deals with those who engage in insurrection, but also allows the exclusion of people who have given aid or comfort to our enemies. And that is not well defined. I protested against the Vietnam War long ago. I've got colleagues who have voted against aid to Israel, and presumably someone could argue that either of those acts is making the enemies of the United States feel aided. So we need at some point to have statutes that that carefully define this section, up until now obscure section of the 14th Amendment. As to whether Trump engaged in insurrection or only aided insurrection, whether the presidency is covered even by Section 3, we're going to have to see the court set rule.
All right, Congressman Brad Sherman, the Democrat from California, great to have you weigh in and join us today. Thank you so much, and a Happy New Year to you. This is Sound On Bloomberg Radio.